Welcome back to the Anchored Podcast, the official podcast of the Classic Learning Test. My name is Soren Schwab, VP of Partnerships here at CLT, and today we are joined by Clark Durant. Clark is the co-founder and former chair and CEO of the Cornerstone Schools in Detroit. He currently serves as CEO of the Cornerstone Education Group, a charter management company, and he's chair of the board. Cornerstone serves over 3,200 children across 5 campuses. As president of the State Board of Education in 1994, Durant led the adoption of a vision, philosophy, and mission statement which sought to define an excellent education, strengthen standards, accountability, character, and encourage the development of charter schools. He served on the Coalition for All Detroit School Children, where he was a co-chair of academics. He is a former vice president at Hillsdale College and a co-founder of the Imprimis, the Washington Hillsdale Intern Program, and the Center for Constructive Alternatives. President Reagan nominated and the U.S. Senate confirmed Clark to the board of the Legal Services Corporation, where he served 4 years as its chairman. Durant has earned degrees from Tulane University and the University of Notre Dame Law School, was a member of the Law Review, and taught a Great Books program in the undergraduate school. He actively practiced law for 25 years in Detroit, spending 7 of those years consistently representing people who could not afford a lawyer. He and his wife Susan have been married for 50 years, and they have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. Clark, it is such an honor to have you on today. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Soren. It's my pleasure. I've heard great things about your work, so it's an honor for me to have this conversation with you.
Well, the honor is truly all mine. This is actually part 1 of a 2-part series about the Cornerstone Schools, your work, the history and mission, and your decision to bring classical education to the inner city. And also, too, and that's going to be the second part of this interview, will be with Dr. Anika Prather and her work with Cornerstone, and that work of Johns Hopkins University. And so we are thrilled to have you. And I got to be honest, the bio was about twice the length. And this morning I have to cut it short a little bit. Not to minimize all your all your accomplishments, but it's truly remarkable the life you have lived and the impact you have made. And so let's get right in. And we always start the Anchored podcast by talking about our guests' own educational journey. So talk to us a little bit about your own educational background. What kind of schools did you attend, and how did you become involved in education?
Well, my mother and father, who were married for 63 years, were my first teachers. There were 4 of us, 3 boys and a girl. My dad had a library that, when he died, had close to 9,000 books in it. So we were a family of readers and surrounded by good conversation. The linear version of where I went to school, I started at a public school named Richard School. It was named after a Catholic priest, Gabriel Richard. I did that from kindergarten through the 6th grade. In 7th grade, our mother and father made a sacrifice to send my brother Peter and me. Peter was a year older than me. To go to the private school in Grosse Pointe, which was called then Grosse Pointe University School. So I attended there from 7th grade through 12th grade. I had a wonderful Latin teacher at, we called it GUPUS, GPUS. His name was Francis McCann from Massachusetts, and also a woman named Betsy Ferguson. And from them, I grew to a love of Latin, starting in the 7th grade through really the first or second year of college. And I've always appreciated that because of the help that it is in thinking and writing and other things. And I was not a great student. I was involved in a number of activities, but I've always been grateful that for my 7th grade, my graduating class in the 12th grade was 48 kids. So I was always used to learning in a small context. which is oftentimes really the best way of learning and ultimately self-learning. From I have a sort of an interesting. I only applied to one college.
Wow.
I played golf, and I thought I could be on the Duke University golf team and go to Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. So I only applied to Duke, and on April 1st of my senior year, the headmaster, a man named Gilder Jackson, came in. I was sitting in the library, and he said, "Clark, I've got bad news for you. Duke hasn't even put you on the waiting list." And I'd hit golf balls. The coach's name, I still remember it after all these years. His name was Dumpy Hegler. Very nice man, but clearly I was not of the caliber that he would want to recruit me. I mean, I love the game and I've played it all my life. And for that, I'm very grateful because it's led to a lot of relationships that have helped me in my work. But it wasn't good enough for Duke. And so Dr. Jackson said, I know the admissions director at Tulane University. I know you want to go south. I'd read a book entitled The Mind of the South. I want to say by William Cash. It may have been Wilbur Cash. Really a fascinating book. Anyway, so he said, I know the admissions director at Tulane University. I can get you an appointment. I can't get you in. And hopefully that will work. So my wonderful father, 2 days later, we drove down in our little Rambler, stopped in Jackson, Mississippi, get a few hours sleep and a shower, and drove into New Orleans. Had the interview. I was accepted on the spot, for which God had his hand in all of this, because when I look at the work that I was ultimately to do in my life, being in New Orleans, being at Tulane was a much better thing than being at Duke and in Durham, North Carolina. So I was always grateful. So I had 4 years at Tulane, and I was an economics major, and had some wonderful experiences. One of which was to be the first undergraduate asked to put together something called the Direction Program that had been started in the law school. It was 4 days of a symposium, a lot of conversation, where you'd have a lot of people respecting each other from different points of view. And so I was able to do that as a senior, and I was invited to a dinner at the president's home. His name was Herbert Longenecker. Lived in a big old antebellum home on St. Charles. And the man that I was seated next to for dinner was then the president of the University of Notre Dame. It was Father Theodore Hesburgh, who I think was the longest serving president of Notre Dame. And he was a young, very masculine priest, very thoughtful man. I still have, my mother had this black and white picture, and when she died, it was kind of in her little collection of things and whatever. And but I was kind of a dorky looking kid, still am. But it's there I was with Father Ted Hesburgh, and then the chairman of the board of the Tulane trustees. But anyway, at dinner over dessert, and I was a good Presbyterian kid. Um, Father Hesburgh said to me, "You ought to come," because I was going to go to law school. He said, "You ought to come to Notre Dame for law school." Now that wasn't even on my radar screen. I was thinking maybe I would go to Michigan or Chicago or some other Midwest school. Notre Dame wasn't even on, not because of any anti-Catholic bias. It just wasn't in my experience, if you will. But I was very touched that this president of this very distinguished university would be asking me to come there for law school. Now, I had to go in the Army. I was asked by the first president of Hillsdale, a man named George Roche, if I would come and work at Hillsdale to do some things that I was doing in New Orleans. But when I finished that work, both the brief time in the Army as an officer and then at Hillsdale, I called Father Hesburgh's office up, and he remembered the call and the meeting, and I went to Notre Dame for law school. And I'm very grateful for that. That was, as I say, as a good Presbyterian boy, but I I taught the great books in the undergraduate school, but I was also teaching myself. I was attending classes in political theory with a wonderful man named Gerhard Niemeyer, Dr. Niemeyer, who wrote for Bill Buckley and National Review, but he was a very distinguished professor in his own right. Joe Evans was a Jacques Maritain scholar and started the Maritain Center. I sat in on some of his classes. So while I was teaching undergraduates, I was learning myself, which is really the best way of learning, because you have to own it to share it. You cannot give what you do not
Mm-hmm.
have. So, but my formal schooling, so to speak, was from little Gabriel Richard to Grosse Pointe University School, Tulane, then the interlude at Hillsdale, working for Hillsdale and developing some educational programs, and then law school at Notre Dame.
Fascinating, Clark. And of course, as a Hillsdale graduate, I have so many follow-up questions that we do not have time to to answer. And your involvement in so many things that I benefited from many years later. But I want to ask you, since it's obviously an education podcast, you practiced law for over 2 decades. Um, how did you get involved in education? In particular, I'm interested in how you got involved with charter schools.
Um, well, it's a very interesting, God never draws in straight lines. Uh, One quick thing about Hillsdale, you're very fortunate to be a graduate of Hillsdale. And
Thank you.
Dr. Larry Arnn has done some extraordinary work to strengthen the college and its place in our American culture. But how did I get to education, and particularly charter schools, from practicing law? When I came back to Detroit from Notre Dame, um, I practiced law with my father. I wasn't initially planning to do that. My mother, in fact, was the person who called. Susan and I had just gotten married. A little girl was going to be born in June of 1976, the year I was graduating from law school. And my mother said, your dad would love it if you came back and practiced law with him. Now, you have to understand something about my father. He never graduated from high school. He never went to college. And when he was 52 years old, he started law school. And the only law school that would take an uncredentialed, even though well-read man, was the University of Detroit, a Jesuit college.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dad started law school 2 years before I started at Notre Dame.
Wow.
And I was on law review at Notre Dame, and my father did better than I did. And I always loved that. So when my mother, said, your father won't call you or tell you this, but I know he'd love it if you would come back. So I came back to Detroit. Dad had these little offices on the 23rd floor of the Penobscot building. The elevator only went to the 22nd floor, so therefore it was cheaper to be in the 23rd floor. So there were no clients. And I said to my father, I said, Dad, how am I, I've just got a little mortgage, a little baby girl, and a young marriage. I got to pay my bills. How are we going to do this? And he pulled out a card and he said, you go over to the recorder's court, which was basically the criminal court in Detroit, and you tell the judges you will represent anybody who can't afford a lawyer. And I said to my father, Dad, how's this going to work? But my father was a good and honorable man, captain in World War II. So I went over to the judges, told them I'd represent, anybody who couldn't afford a lawyer. And I thought that was just going to be a 1 year, 2 year sort of dipping into the practice of law. It lasted for almost 7 years. And what I would encounter were young men and women, but mostly men, who had made bad choices, had great skills, but made bad choices. And they weren't finding, and I just was this was a seed being planted in my life. It's not like I jumped up and said, oh, I'm going to go do schools. But I encountered these immensely talented young people, but they had not been properly formed to appreciate fully who they could be. But it was a very rich experience. And as a result of, I went into public life. President Reagan is deputy attorney general called and asked if I'd come down. That's how I ended up being confirmed by the Senate and heading up this agency to represent poor people across the country. And that led to a whole series of things. And ultimately, when I came back to Detroit, although I was commuting, so to speak, but when I really finished all of that, a new archbishop had come to Detroit in 1990. And his name was Adam Maida, a very humble man. He's still alive. He's 91 or 92. Very humble man. And he had been asked by the mayor and other civic leaders to give a talk to the city. As he was new to the city, it would be kind of like his inaugural address. And he spoke in front of the Economic Club of Detroit. Coleman Young was the mayor who was there. And he did something very unusual for a business audience. He quoted from scripture, and he quoted from the book of Revelation, 21st chapter, about a new Jerusalem, God coming down from heaven, dwelling with his people, and a new Jerusalem, and all things would be made new again. I can't say the quote fully here, but anybody who knows Revelation 21 knows exactly what I'm talking about. And so he cast this vision for the city. And with great humility, at the end of his talk, he mentions that there needs to be a new kind of a school. Now, remember, this is a man who heads up his own school system, and he has the humility to say, can we set up something new? So when I was not there when he spoke, but I went and got the talk because of a conversation I had with the editorial editor of the Detroit News. And when I read that, my heart leapt. I knew that somehow or other I was to go and help him set whatever these schools were to be. I was to help him set it up. That God had put this on my heart. So I went, we had a meeting. Long story short, he ultimately asked me 7 or 8 months later if I would be the founding chairman. They were to be set up as private schools. This is the road to the charters. They were to be set up as private schools and to be Christ-centered schools. And that was it. So we opened the door, took 167 kids in 1991, and really never looked back. But John Engler was running for governor in 1994. And John had asked me if I would be on his ticket to run for the State Board of Education because he admired the work that Cornerstone, we'd just gotten started, but we'd done some pretty good things in the very beginning. And John asked me to be on his ticket to run for the State Board of Education. And that was successful. And as a result of that, I went on the State Board of Education. John asked if I would serve as president of the board because one of the things that he wanted to do was to start charter schools. So he had a wonderful team of people, a guy named Richard McClellan and others who began to, put the legislation together. We changed a few things at the state board level, but ultimately created the platform to do the work. So John says to me, well, Cornerstone needs to be one of those first charter schools. And I said, John, I can't do that. I said, I'm trying to do a Christ-centered model that's rooted in building community and with a broad and beloved community of friends to provide this excellent education to the children and their families. And I just don't want to get into the politics of what might be these charter schools. But I'll obviously support them, help you get them off the ground. And I would say that John Engler's greatest legacy as governor will be the fact that he opened the door to allow these charter options for parents. And we did not go into the charter space until 2008. And the reason we went into that space, because we had about 2,400 private school kids. We had 4 different locations. But then the economic tsunami came and we were running out of money. I mean, that's just the bottom line. I've never, I don't think, ever publicly said this, but we were literally going to run out in March and miss payrolls. But God brought some wonderful people together and we were able to generate the cash to allow us to finish the year. No one ever knew how close we really came. But in that process, we set up a strategic planning committee headed by a man named Bill Pulte, the home builder. And we decided that the best thing forward was to try to bring the values that were the core of our private school and bring them into the richness, but of what could be a public school, but also to serve children that were in a very different place, even compared to the poor children that we were serving in the private school. All Black, all poor, but in the private school, you could charge for it. You could have parents sign covenants of responsibility. There are a lot of things you could do that you can't do in the public space. But it's important to be in the public space because that's where 90% of the kids go. And we need to have a new way of shaping and forming and helping young people to have flourishing in their lives. And you can't do that in the private space. You got to be willing to get into the public. So we transitioned ultimately, and we didn't do it all at once, but we opened our first charter in the school year of 2009.
Wow, that is a fascinating story. Thanks for sharing that, Clark. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard about some of the critiques of charter schools, and a lot of it, of course, is very misinformed, and maybe even some of the perception that, oh yeah, charter schools, you're serving kind of the suburban white families, we could put white picket fence, and that is not what you're doing at the Cornerstone Schools. So I would love to pick your brain a little bit on kind of the mission of the Cornerstone Schools, and if that has changed, as you transition from private into charter, or have you been able to stay true to your mission while, of course, not being able to as openly be Christ-centered?
Well, it's been a very interesting journey. We started out, as I say, in the private school space, and our mission was to build a broad and beloved community of friends who would deliver an excellent education to our children and their families, rooted in the gospel of Christ. Very simple. Now, obviously, in the way in which I just said that to you, you can't do that in the public space.
Right.
But we knew that because we'd been very successful as a private school, that if there were, and there's no question, the culture and the formation of character was the core of it, and to form it in relationship to the gospel and gospel values, and the person of Christ, obviously. So as we thought about how do we enter this space and try ultimately to create a new kind of a model. Now, we stayed initially with the model of providing this excellent education within this broad and beloved community, and to do this in the public space. And what we found from roughly 2009, really for the first 10 years or so, was this is a whole new world. And it's when I was president of the State Board of Education and I went around, I made it a point to go to Muskegon, to Flint, to Saginaw, to Muskegon, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, Detroit, all the areas that are of, the urban character. And I found, two things. And it's the same thing I found when I was doing the work representing people who couldn't afford a lawyer. I found enormous potential. And I found potential that had not been developed the way it deserved to be and had as a human being. And so it was a missed opportunity. Good people, always good people. You go into this space, I don't care what your politics are, you go into this space to try to teach others and serve others. That's a badge of honor. And, but it's operating within a government structure. And I used to say to people who had children, I said, think of the basic responsibilities that you have. You have to feed, clothe, shelter, transport, and educate, and many other things. But if you just took those 5 things, feed, clothe, shelter, transport, and educate, and then ask yourself, what does our society do to deliver the quality in those 5 things? Feeding. Well, we don't run government farms. If we did, it'd be like the Soviet Union and we'd starve and we wouldn't have the things that we needed. Feeding. Clothing. We don't, have government clothing stores. We, in fact, have this rich diversity of things that create surpluses. Transportation. We have something called the automobile. We have all sorts of different ways of transporting. But the main thing, these are not delivered by the government. Shelter. We don't live in public housing. We wherever you are, 95% or more of the population lives in housing stock that is created through the spontaneous and voluntary order of a free society. But schooling, we're delivering it by the government. We're delivering it through entities that are immediately and exclusively controlled by the state. Again, good people. But if you're, I used to be involved with an investment firm, and you'd listen to different people coming by, seeking capital for their ideas. Everybody has a creativity and a uniqueness, and we're trying to do this in structures that for other basic things we would never choose. We wouldn't choose it for feeding, clothing, sheltering, and transporting. So why is something as important as education? Now, why do I say that? Because for the 10 years, we were just saying we can't fully achieve how hard it is to achieve. And we have a great authorizer, great university, Grand Valley State University. But it's just within a framework that makes it hard to find the talent, the flexibility, and a different way of accountability for outcomes. And so that really led to having to rethink, is there a different way to do this?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think the conversation about school choice and and alternative options for families, even, taxpayer dollars for education, to be able to use for whether it's private school or charter school. I think we've come a long way, even just the last 5 to 10 years there.
But children are still not treated equally. If you're in the
not.
main system,
right.
You get certain funding. And if you're in the charter system or other choices that parents want to make, children should be seen equally. And it should not depend on the political arrangement of the way something is done.
Right. And of course, you are in Michigan, right, where other states are a little bit ahead in when it comes to the money following the child and not the system itself. So hopefully we can work on that in Michigan there as well. So you have five schools now that are part of the Cornerstone Schools, and I'm going to read the names: Adams Young, Jefferson Douglas, Madison Carver, Washington Parks, and Lincoln King. I'm sensing a pattern there, but I want you to kind of speak about the rationale behind the naming of your schools.
Well, we do it because we're trying to tell a story. And we started this the moment we transitioned to charters. We wanted to have this naming convention. And you notice, for example, it's not George Washington, Rosa Parks, or Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King. We take Washington Parks, Lincoln King, Jefferson Douglas, Madison Carver, Adams and Young, because we want to tell this connected and unfolding story. When we had, after George Floyd was killed, and we had, I got some respectful letters about changing the names because three of the individuals, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, all owned slaves. But we had a rich conversation within our community over 3 lengthy periods of time. Ultimately, we never needed to change the names because people began to realize we had created something very unique. And my dear friend, Ambassador Andrew Young, when I was talking to him about wanting to have him as one of the namesakes, he loved the idea of this unfolding story. Although he leaned forward, we were having lunch, and he leaned forward in Atlanta and he said, "But who are you going to pair me with, Clark?" And and I said John Adams, and his face lit up. I mean, and he ticked off 3 or 4 different reasons, why that was such an honor to him. But it was an honor to be in this whole mix of people. And but that's why we do it, and it's been very rich. We need to, as individuals, whether we're adults or students, we're always students, we need to have a better understanding of this unfolding story rather than trying to divide people about different parts of the story. And they're good parts and they're bad parts.
Right.
Uh, the last time I checked, that's kind of like a human life.
Right. It sounds like a human life. Yeah, I forgot who shared that with me, but someone said, if you look at your grandparents and you think that all they did was just perfect, right? You're very naive, right? If you look at your
Right.
grandparents and think about everything they did was evil and bad, that's not the right approach either, right? The answer is probably somewhere in between. But if you love them, you're going to engage, you're going to look at, and as an immigrant to this country, I'm not naive to think that everything is perfect here, but also understanding that in order to have a more perfect union, we have to also look at the good and build on that. And I think the story that you're telling is one other step in getting there. And so, yeah, kudos to you and what you're building. Let's talk a little bit about curriculum, pedagogy. There seems to be a lot of charter schools that are very very kind of progressive in their models, sometimes indistinguishable from the public schools, and we also have kind of this groundswell of classical charter schools that look maybe curriculum wise a bit more like private schools. Where does Cornerstone fall, and has that evolved over time?
Well, we made the decision slowly, um, but that we needed to go in this classical direction. Um, and I've thought about this from a number of different perspectives. I'll give you a little anecdote. A couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, my wife and my daughter went to a garage sale and downtown, and they found face down this book. And um, Susan, my dear wife of 50 years, is flipping through it, and my daughter Maggie, and they're saying, Dad would love this book. So they brought it home. They paid $5 for this. And it's immeasurable value, immeasurable, because the book is a pictorial capturing of the first time that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And nobody knows when it is. You ask any of your friends, any of your listeners, before I give you the answer, nobody knows. Nobody remembers, which is a sad part, because if we cannot remember, we cannot be fully human. So anyway, but the first time was in May of 1957. It was the prayer pilgrimage for freedom. The image that I'm showing you is a picture of Mahalia Jackson. You can see the great Corinthian pillars of the Lincoln Memorial and Lincoln Monument and the American flag. And in the lower right corner is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And when you go through the book, I'll tell you a funny story. When I took this down to Atlanta to show my friend Andrew Young, he was like he was like a young kid flipping through the book and looking at the pictures. And I mean, they are exquisite pictures. And the photographer was a young 19-year-old named Lee Friedlander. And Lee had gone down to Washington, heard about this thing, took all these fabulous pictures. It is extraordinary to look at them. And Andy was looking at him, and I said, Andy, why does this capture you? He said, Clark, I drove all night from my little church in Thomasville, Georgia, to be there to hear Dr. King and to be a part of this prayer pilgrimage. He'd only met King in February of 1957, and they became dear friends for the rest of Reverend Dr. King's life. But at this moment, King gave a talk that's, I think, one of his best, probably his second best, and I don't think I Have a Dream is the best, although I love it to pieces because he's a great writer. But in this talk, King challenges his own people, but he's also challenging our country to inject a new vein of love into civilization and to save Western civilization in
Mm-hmm.
her darkest hour. Now, and it's a beautiful thing. And he says when that happens, and I'm going to read you this last page because it's so beautiful. He says, when that happens, and referring to the people who stood up with dignity and honor and saved Western civilization in her darkest hour, when that happens, the morning stars will sing together and the sons of God will shout for joy. It's
Beautiful.
beautiful. So I'm saying to myself, self, this is what our young people and families at Cornerstone need to fully appreciate. If the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King can stand on the steps before he's fully he became a national public man after this, but when he comes as having done the work he did at Dexter Avenue and the Montgomery bus boycott and some other things, but he became a very different man when he gave this talk. And it's a beautiful thing. So for Cornerstone, it was this idea that we need to begin to think about how do we save, as Dr. King had called us to, Western civilization at her darkest hour. And that began this journey. I had a number of conversations with Ambassador Young. It's how we came to, frankly, set up the Andrew J. Young Center for the Andrew J. Young Cornerstone Center for the Complete Life. And it provided a way of rethinking. And we came to a mission. And maybe let me just almost close it with saying this to you. Our mission is we seek for ourselves, for our students, faculty, family, and staff to live the complete life in the unfolding of the American promise. And as the Reverend Dr. King taught us, such a life is to live for a purpose born, to be a person for others, and to know God. And on this journey, we will carry with us humility, patience, curiosity, courage, prudence, forgiveness, and joy. And we will find the things that are good and that are true and that are beautiful. Now, that's what we want to be about.
Wow. Wow, Clark. I'm sure our listeners are, I don't know, I have goosebumps. I hope they do too. But what a beautiful mission it is. And I know that
In a public
in a
school.
public school, that's what public schools could look like, right? Cornerstone is a great model for that. In the second episode that we'll be recording and releasing on Thursday, we'll talk more about this transition to a more classical model. We're going to talk about the Andrew J. Young Cornerstone Center for a Complete Life, and of course, we're bringing in our dear friend Dr. Anika Prather from Johns Hopkins and her work alongside you, partnering with you to bring this beautiful, rich education to your schools, and hopefully as a model for so many more schools around the country. Before I let you go, though, I do have to ask you one question, which is sometimes the most difficult to answer. But you have lived such a rich life, and you're so well read. I see in the background, hundreds, there are probably thousands of books. Could you point at one book or one text apart from scripture, because I know that's obviously probably the most impactful, but one text that has been most influential or impactful in your life? Is that
I
even
would
possible?
say, I would say if you'd allow me, I'd say it's two things. Um, After I graduated from Tulane and I was working north of New York City, I was supposed to prepare teachers about how to teach economics, Austrian economics in particular. And sitting on a library, on a closet shelf were four paperback books, and they were by Clive Staples Lewis. They were by C.S. Lewis. The one I picked off was The Great Divorce,
Hmm.
and I read that. It was late at night. It was probably midnight. I couldn't put it down. And I love the story of these seven people who take this imaginary bus trip to the outskirts of heaven, and each one is confronted essentially with the choice of my will or thy will. And only one is able to embrace it's not about my will, it's about the Lord's will, and then go, as Lewis' lovely phrase, farther up and further in. So I would say that book began to really cause me to think about, was I preparing myself to be able to make such a choice? But the other book I would say, that has been influential in my thinking early on was G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man.
Mhm.
And my brother was the one who introduced me to Chesterton. He sent me 3 essays and all this sort of stuff. Uh, but I would say Chesterton's Everlasting Man, because Chesterton shows, first of all, I love the opening where he talks about man in the cave drawing on the walls. Chesterton says man is an artist, and an artist creates. And if he's in the image and likeness of God, he is a sub creator, if you will, in that work. And Chesterton just tells this beautiful story in his, it's a style that you have to become accustomed to. You just don't drop into it. But it's a beautiful thing, the way he talks about man, and then he talks about the man who was God. And it was an answer to H.G. Wells' outline of history, but it's a beautiful, beautiful piece. And I would say those two. I mean, there have been many in my life, and it's really been not just books; it's been people and experiences. But there's no question that Lewis's The Great Divorce. In fact, I was in England about a month ago, and I made a point of going by Lewis's parish and his grave, and I said a little prayer and a little prayer of gratitude to him for not just myself, but for all of those that he affected. And he would be the first person to tell you that Chesterton influenced him when he was an
Mhm.
atheist. So, but I'd say those are the two that probably.
Those are two great choices, and like to say, Chesterton and Lewis were right about almost everything,
Yep.
and so they're certainly good,
I
good,
just
good
wish we had
teachers,
played golf.
right? Well, Clark, this has been delightful. Again, we're here with Clark Durant, who serves as CEO of the Cornerstone Education Group. Please tune back in on Thursday, where Clark is coming back alongside Dr. Nika Prather to talk more about Cornerstone Schools and their educational model and all the amazing work that they're doing. Clark, thank you so much for joining today.
Well, Soren, thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to doing this with my friend Anika. It'll be great fun, and thank you for all your good work at CLT. It's a very important work, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you, sir.